From the Zoomerplex in historic Liberty Village, theZoomer, hosted by Marissa Lennox.
Canada and the United States, that would really be something. You get rid of that artificially drawn line, and you take a look at what that looks like, and it would also be much better for national security. Don't forget, we basically protect Canada. We're spending hundreds of billions a year to protect it, but why are we supporting a country, 200 billion plus a year? Our military is at their disposal. All of these other things, they should be a state. That's why I told Trudeau when he came down, I said, what would happen if we didn't do it? He said Canada would dissolve. Canada wouldn't be able to function.
Welcome to theZoomer. I'm Marissa Lennox. President Trump threw out a joke. Canada took the bait big time. Like any bully, the more we reacted, the more he upped the ante and began to talk about it as if it might be real. Today we're talking about the threat of tariffs and how Canada should handle its relationship with the U.S. going forward. We will also ask, what if Trump, in all his unpredictability, decided to attempt something as crazy as invading Canada? What would that look like? And with Justin Trudeau having starved our military, could we even stand a chance in resisting them? But first, we begin with Diane Francis, the author of Merger of the Century. Diane, you're no stranger to touching the third rail, and I love that. You wrote this book over a decade ago on this idea of a closer union, closer than what we currently have between Canada and the United States, which you say is an inevitability. Why?
Well, I looked at the book, and the book is really also an examination of the two separate cultures, because I'm a Canadian and an American. And so I saw that the two national cultures were divergent in terms of certain goals and attempts to develop their nation. And what I did really was I said, okay, this is what Americans are. I looked at their differences. You know, they're not as polite, they're more blunt, and so on.
Different sensibilities.
Totally. And more Germanic sensibilities, and then Canada. And then I also started to examine the other things. And then I said, you know what? They're going to get fed up with paying for our military, so we better develop our military. Build your military up so that it's reasonably large. It doesn't have to be gigantic. We're not conquering anybody. Have East-West free trade so that we can develop our own industries amongst ourselves and not just go north-south all the time and become dependent. And then develop the North and the Arctic and our resources. And did we do any of those things? Absolutely not.
So you present a number of models, and the one that really stands out to me is this business of a financial acquisition where the U.S. buys Canada or compensates Canada for its resources. How would that work? Okay,
so what I did was I have a relative who's an investment banker, and I said, okay, let's look at the two places, the United States and Canada.
Well, and I think that's an important point. This is not a frivolous exercise.
Oh, no.
This is a very intellectually robust look at what Canada is worth.
So what we did a merger model. And so we did, okay, you got a big company and a little company. Now, how do you compensate and figure out who gets what and who's paid what for this merger? And it's a tried and true pattern. And we looked at the assets of the two nations. We looked at the assets, the natural assets. So we went to the CIA annual report on the assets of all companies. You can look this up in any country. We looked at the value of the amount of fresh water, the amount of oil and gas, minerals, metals, forest, all of that stuff, and then just plain arable land and geography and potential. And we added up what they were worth, and we added up what Canada was worth, and we were worth $17 trillion more than the United States. So when Trump, ignorantly said, oh, be the 51st state, how insulting. We are geographically bigger than the 50 states, and we are richer geologically than the 50 states combined. So then I said, okay, now how do you, then the thought experiment went further. Okay, that means if you join the two as one, that there would have to be compensation for the over-contribution of the asset base to the Canadians. We were about 32 million then. It was $500,000 per person. And then, on top of that, I said, you have to throw in free health care all the way to their grandchildren. That would be the price. And so it's an interesting it's a thought experiment, but I think it puts the lie to anybody thinking that we, A, are not worthless, and B, that there isn't some value here that would have to be compensated.
And not that Canada's for sale, but
Not
certainly
for sale.
beyond the reach of what the U.S. could afford.
Oh, they could afford it, but
They
could afford it, and maybe Canadians would say, you know what, I want to live in Florida anyway. I'll take my $500,000 and I'll get free health care. I don't know.
It would
what
add
people
50% to their debt.
They don't seem to be that worried about their debt. Anyway, that's another topic. But yes, it's a lot of money. Some people say that's nothing for a place like that.
So I would be remiss, even un-Canadian, if I did not ask you, are we not underestimating the value of Canadian patriotism and nationalism when we present a model like this?
It wasn't about patriotism or nationalism. It was about numbers. These are two asset bases. Who's bigger, who's smaller? How would you have to do it if you wanted to buy out one over the other? The big one had to buy out the little one.
Yeah.
So, that's what it was. And I wrote the book and I said, they're both terrific countries. I'm a citizen of both. And, Canada, I'm just telling you, if you keep freeloading and you keep becoming more and more dependent on the U.S. and not developing your own wealth, you're in for trouble. And here we are.
How was your book received a decade ago?
Well, it sold a lot in the U.S., of course, but not as much as you'd think, because Americans really don't think about Canada. They like Canada, they know Canada, they like Canadians, which is actually Canada's biggest asset, which is invaluable. But as we get into this nastiness. But the point is that the reaction among the elites was very negative.
How so?
Well, CBC never put me on air again. Ever, and I was a regular. It wasn't official, but I never got asked to be on TV or radio, which I was constantly asked to do. The elites, the Globe and Mail wouldn't review it, would not review the book. They were horrified. Why? Because I was presenting an idea, not that we would be taken over, but an idea that even if it got out, threatened their elite position in power in a small country. And so that's what they didn't like.
Well, and a more
They also
realistic...
didn't like my politics. I'm pretty small C conservative.
Well, and no one should be blacklisted for their own opinions. But now here we are. We're having these conversations. Has anyone from Trump's camp or O'Leary's camp reached out to you?
Yes. Not officially. I mean, I'm not been summoned to Mar-a-Lago, although I'd go if he asked. But then I would tell him the bill is $17 trillion. Who's kidding who? And by the way, that was 2013 dollars. It's probably 30 trillion now. I'll do the math. Come on. That was just an experiment. But it was also a way of Canadians understanding what value they have here and Americans understanding what value Canada
Well,
has.
we'll unpack some of the other models presented in Diane's book after the break. She's sticking around. The panel will join us on the other side. Don't go away. We're back with our panel. Joining us in studio, Warren Kinsella and Brian Lilly, and by remote, Conrad Black and Jim Stanford. Let's begin with reaction to Diane. Canada and the U.S. are gradually merging, with Canada becoming more dependent on the U.S. for protection, investment, trade. And if Canada doesn't address these shortcomings, Brian, it risks being swallowed up. What do you think?
Well, I went back and I looked at the numbers. I thought, how dependent were we on the British Empire? And found numbers on StatsCan's website. It's great. In 1896, 60% of our exports went to the British Empire, either directly to the UK or other countries within the empire. That's far less than we're reliant on the United States now. And I'm not sure that we can say that we are able to provide adequate defense. We're not great partners on NORAD. So we either have to pay up and do the right things to be a proper country, or we are at risk. Now, do I think that we should merge? No. Do I think that if we're vulnerable if we don't start paying our bills and acting properly? Absolutely.
Jim, your thoughts on this?
Well, I don't think that companies are like countries. I think there's a big difference. So I don't think that Diane's analogy of, mapping out the terms of a merger is really appropriate here. There's so much more going on. and not just in the kind of emotional things about patriotism and loyalty and so on, but in the economics of it as well. I do agree with Diane on one thing, which is that we as Canadians should know what we're worth, and obviously her surprising and sort of counterintuitive conclusion that our country is actually worth more than America. I find that surprising. But even in a day-to-day way, understanding the Canada-U.S. trade balance, for example, our center issued a report this week called "Who's Subsidizing Whom?" Notice the correct grammar there, Conrad. I know you're a stickler for grammar. I got the whom in there. And it shows, if anything, we're subsidizing the Americans because of some uniquely sweet aspects of the bilateral relationship. And in all of those ways, I think Canadians should be more aware and more confident and more forceful of the value that we bring to the continental table, rather than just seeing us as a charity case or a junior partner that it will inevitably get swallowed up.
Conrad, I'll bring you in here. What about an economic union? If Canadians were given parity on the US dollar, would that be something that more Canadians would be willing to receive?
Well, if you mean a single currency for both countries and treating the Canadian dollar, which has fallen to rather embarrassing levels, as equal to an American dollar, obviously a lot of people would take that bribe. But the idea of just scrapping the country, I have to agree with the sentiments that have been expressed that I think that would not be a popular idea and would not be the best solution to the problems of this country from any angle. I mean, but I do think, and I think both Diane and, well, everyone who's spoken has, in a way, made this point that we're kind of at a turning point. We can either proceed to becoming a fully autonomous country that pulls its own weight and pays its way in defending itself, or we can contemplate folding it up. But I don't think many Canadians would like to do that. I mean, I think the thread through Canadian history, going back to Champlain, is that we do have an opportunity in the northern half of this continent to build a very desirable society. But obviously, if the Americans said, "Look here, we'll give you one American dollar for every Canadian dollar. Why don't you pack it in?" I agree with I think Moses' statement of 13% is an underestimation. I think more than 13% would vote for that, but I think the majority would not. We can do better, but we haven't done. I don't want to make a partisan statement here, but we haven't done well in the last 10 years, as Diane knows very well. We've had terrible capital outflows, including Canadians themselves, because there are better places to invest in Canada because of poor public policy. On this business of Trump, he's not serious. He's playing poker. And the idea of responding to complaints about people crossing our border into the U.S. by raising tariffs is a non sequitur. I mean, we're not East Germany. We're not building walls to keep people in. And it is the responsibility of all countries to set up whatever processes they think appropriate at their borders about incoming people. And Trump's real complaint, as he showed in the election in November, was his predecessor's conduct on the southern border. He has no complaint with us, really, about how we handle our border. If we should do a little more, fine, let's do it. But in any case, that's not a terror list.
All right, I take your point, Conrad, and I do agree that Trump's rhetoric is a bit of a red herring. But imagine trading resources in U.S. dollars. Imagine maybe Canadians have a seat or two at the Federal Reserve. What would that look like?
It's not a red herring. He means it. I worked, full disclosure, for Kamala Harris as a volunteer. He campaigned on it every single day, tariffs. He has a mandate to do it, and he needs the revenue to pay for his tax cut. He means it. It's going to happen. A week from now, we're going to be talking about an economy that is going to be in a tremendous state of distress. But, here's Doug Ford. This has become the most popular hat in the country at the moment.
Can we pull up that visual?
See that? Canada's not for sale. So there's a conservative leader of Ontario, and I can tell you that is the most popular hat in the country in the past hour. And that's across the political spectrum. Left, right, east, west, young, old. Getting back to what Mr. Black said, if you measure public opinion, which is the most important thing, not the dollar value, exchange rate, if you measure public opinion in this country going back decades, we regularly ask this question: do you want to join the United States? And whether people are conservative or liberal or whatever, or however distressed they are about the way in which the country's being governed, the answer is always no. It's a non-starter.
But you can maintain your sovereignty, you can maintain your identity if you form a union similar to the European Union.
Yeah, I looked at all the different possibilities to give Canadians a choice. You know, okay, you're going to neglect what you should be doing, so you're going to be in trouble. So think about these options. And the European Union works, it's very complicated. It took years to devise. But, you know, their cultures are not at risk. They're not being gobbled up culturally and politically. They come together as a European Union, and they have a common currency, and that works fine. I think that would be the best model if we're going to move forward in some way.
Look, I think there is an ideal level of integration in this continent, and we, both Americans and ourselves, want to find it. But we have to start, I think, I can deduce this from what everyone has said, by governing ourselves a bit better, so we've got a stronger hand of cards to play in the discussions with the U.S. But Canada, the greatest problem we've got is it's the greatest resource treasure house in the world, and for a variety of reasons, we became ashamed of our resources. We should be maximizing our exports of natural resources to the world, which is clamoring for what we have, and we have everything except tropical fruit.
In trade deficits, we're losing massive. We don't need their cars. You know, they make 20% of our cars. We don't need that. I'd rather make them in Detroit. We don't need the cars. We don't need their lumber. We don't need anything they have. We don't need their dairy products. We have more than they have. We don't need anything. So why are we losing $200 billion a year and more to protect Canada? And why should we have a $200 billion deficit and add on to that many, many other things that we give them in terms of subsidy? And I said, that's okay to have if you're a state.
Brian, is he wrong to say that Canada has nothing the U.S. needs?
No, because he's contradicting himself at the same time. He's saying he wants the whole country, but at this, just after he's saying they have nothing that we want. Of course, we have things that he wants. It's why he wants to take over. My worry actually is that it started as a joke, but what if he's serious? Our level of dependency on the Americans without properly governing ourselves, whether it's the military, whether it's trade diversification. And look, I know that's incredibly difficult. Going back to the Martin government, I remember interviewing Jim Peterson as he was heading off for the first meetings with South Korea. Stephen Harper did a tremendous job of trying to expand trade agreements. And I can't remember how many more we have now. But we're still just focused on the States, and we're still just trading with the States despite all these agreements. So if Trump is serious, my worry is what levers do we have to stop it? If he just says, I will bring your economy to your knees, we're vulnerable.
Excellent point. I just wanted to add something too from the point of view of a business writer, great points, is that the trading relationship, Canada calls itself a trading nation. Canada's exports and imports are nothing more, predominantly nothing more than intercorporate transfers between head offices and subsidiaries, both sides. So we're not a trading nation. That's why we're totally dependent on the U.S. And the other ironic thing is that the oil industry in Canada, which is the most important industry in Canada, and the car industry, which is the second most important, it's American-owned. It's American-owned.
But the one thing to remember as everyone looks at what Trump is talking about is he does not believe the orthodoxy on tariffs. So you can ask Jim and other economists, and they'll talk about tariffs being detrimental to the economy. They'll point to Smoot-Hawley in 1936 that worsened the Great Depression. And you read Peter Navarro, who I've interviewed many times. You read Robert Lighthizer, who is Trump's former trade representative, informs a lot of his thinking. They believe tariffs are fundamentally good and will benefit the American economy and benefit American workers and bring back jobs to places like Ohio, where manufacturing base and that part of the economy has been ravaged. So, we're saying this is going to hurt your economy, and they're saying, no, it won't.
It goes against everything that is core to my understanding about prosperity. What is good for the world is good for America. And yet, here we are having these conversations. It feels like it's the end of the era of globalism, of globalization, Warren. You were working in government when NAFTA was signed. What was the mood at the time? Were there any concerns about tariffs coming down and the impact that that would have? Because, of course, NAFTA turned out to be one of the greatest things for Canada.
No, there was a great debate, though, within the Liberal Party of Canada. Brian was covering it, and I was on the inside at the time. And we had people like Olayde Axworthy who were very concerned. The left wing of the Liberal Party thought, we were handing over our sovereignty. And that wasn't the case. However, there were many concerns that were expressed that turned out to be well-founded by trade unions, for example, that we were going to be losing our manufacturing capability, our labor force, and some of those things did happen. So, but the response to that, if you have an inadequacy in your trade agreement, as we do with the United States, whether it's expressed at the border or immigration or whatever aspect of our relationship with them is problematic. The response is not to say you're going to take over the United States, the Canada. The response is not to say we're the 51st state. Like this debate about what relationship we need to have with the United States, that's always a proper debate within this country. What is unhelpful is to have this debate with this man. And so I don't have the relationship with him that Mr. Black does. I think he is a menace. I think he is an unstable force in world affairs. And not only is he causing disruption here, in this country, he's doing this with Denmark and Greenland and Panama, to the point where Britain and France actually had to make a pronouncement on Article 5 of the NATO Charter saying, if he does that to Denmark, we will be forced to respond. Like before he's even taken office, he's destroyed NATO. Like it is extraordinary, these things that are happening in the past few days. And as I say, a lot of them are proper debates to have, but not with this man. This man is
but he's the
menace.
He's the man we have to have the discussion
That's
with
right.
because he's coming in.
The other thing, too, is that going to 32,000 feet altitude, this is a shift in the world order for two reasons. And I don't think it's baseless. I don't like his style, okay? He trash talks. That's how he does negotiation. He's trash talking us. We should just ignore it. But what he's doing is he's addressing the fact that America has $1 trillion a year trade deficit. They can't sustain that forever. So they have to do something about their trade deficits.
Globally.
Globally. And the second problem they have is they've been the policeman to the world. They can't afford it anymore.
Yeah, but I don't know where he comes up with that 200.
Well,
Can I jump in? Can I jump in on that $200 billion number that Mr. Trump threw out?
Yeah,
we just can't let that pass.
That's rubbish.
He made the number up. The number isn't, there's nowhere that there's a $200 billion deficit with Canada. The U.S. official data says it was $40 billion in 2023. It fell about 10% last year, when we'll know when we get the year-end numbers. And it's probably less than that because the official trade statistics don't count much of the trade in services where the U.S. has the huge advantage. They've got the biggest banks, they've got the biggest tech companies, the biggest streaming companies, the biggest digital platforms. Every time we buy something from Netflix or Uber or Meta or Google, it is a services import from the United States, but it doesn't show up in the official data.
I violently disagree with Warren Kinsella's reference to Trump. In fact, the world is, except for those enemies of the West, like Iran and North Korea, and to some degree China, are rejoicing that we're getting the vacuum filled in Washington, and the United States will now resume its role as the world's most important country. We're going to have peace in Ukraine and the Middle East quite quickly. And there has been no exit strategy in those wars prior to this. So, I mean, there's room for certainly objections to some of Trump's stylistic infelicities, and I've objected to them myself. But to just stick with this theory that he's a madman a dangerous character who could blow up the world. I mean, this is just nonsense, Warren. I can't believe you're serious. And in any case, it is a democracy, and they've elected fair and square.
Here, let me give you a quote then, Conrad. I have a real problem with some of the things Donald Trump is saying. It doesn't sound to me like the pronouncements of somebody who's a friend, a partner, or an ally, which is what I've always thought the United States is our country. That's Stephen Harper said that. So, I think, you're defending your friend, and you should, I guess. But
No, I defend Stephen too, but I don't agree with him. I mean, look, Trump has his own way of doing things, but he absolutely is not interested in harming Canada. Frankly, there's an element in here of his relations with Justin, who he feels has deliberately aggravated him at times in a way that was uncalled for. But the fact is, he's not anti-Canadian. And Canada's a sideshow. I mean, Americans like Canadians, and they don't really have a serious grievance against Canada. And the most important thing not that this is particularly under discussion here, but for our appreciation of Trump, he is going to get that economy really roaring. And when America is really prosperous, it is always a good thing in this country. So, you just live with some of his rhetorical flourishes. He's actually going to be a positive development for us. And he is not, in fact, going to impose 25% tariffs on us. Negotiations are in progress, and as I understand it, they're proceeding quite well.
You don't believe he'll impose a 25% tariff on Canadian exports?
No.
It was his opening shot. It was his opening shot in negotiations.
Well, then why would the Premier of Ontario go out yesterday, as he did, and said that we're going to lose 500,000 jobs? What politician in their right mind would go out and say something like that unless it was an actual possibility?
Not to mention Danielle Smith was at Mar-a-Lago.
Warren, he's likely to be having an election campaign. He's now Captain Canada. And, the conservative leader being Mr. Patriotism is pretty good. He's not just saying, pretty good as a tactic. He's not just saying they'll lose 500,000 jobs. He's saying the Americans will pay for this. They need our potash. They need our uranium. I mean, he's got quite a pitch worked up there. And he's sort of testing, depending on whether he goes for an election soon or not. I mean, you've been in politics for decades, and you don't need me to tell you that. You don't need me to tell you what his motives are.
All right.
So there's rhetoric on both sides.
All right, we're short on time. Brian, why don't you put a bow on this for us?
I think that we have to consider the very real possibility that the tariffs will come. Danielle Smith said that coming out of Mar-a-Lago. Is it an opening shot? Absolutely. It's a negotiation tactic. I said that when he first raised this in November and said, you'll get tariffs unless you fix your border. I said, okay, well, there's an easy ask. If he's serious about wanting the whole country, if he's taking the joke too far, then I don't know where we stand in 6 weeks.
All right, stick around. We'll pick this up on the other side. And later, Major General retired Richard Rohmer, who 50 years ago imagined a U.S. invasion of Canada in his novel Exoneration, and how we fought back. Stay with us.
Prime Minister Justin Trudeau said that there's a snowball's chance in hell that Canada will ever become the 51st state. Well, I'm going to go talk to Canadians to see what they have to say about it.
If states want to come up here, then I'm ready. I'll draw my musket. I'll be there with my bearskin hat, and I'll be down there on the border with the rest of them.
Yeah, I just don't think it's a realistic thing that's going to happen. I think it was a bold comment to make, which is fine. I think it was a joke.
I don't think it's acceptable. No Canadian wants that to be part of 51st state. It just doesn't make sense.
I think it's a bad idea, but I wouldn't be against it if we got American passports.
I think it's ridiculous. I think Canada should stay its own country and we shouldn't be swallowed up by the states.
Well, that's absolutely ridiculous, and I have no intention of even entertaining that. I'm a proud Canadian, and for the rest of my life, I hope to remain a Canadian.
I'm just tired of everyone going with everything that man says.
I think Canada is beautiful on its own and should stay independent like it's right now.
I don't know what Trump's trying to do. I think he's just hustling us a bit before the duties of the tariffs come in.
It's a joke, just like Trump.
Thanks, RJ. Definitely some strong opinions out there. Now it's your turn. Our first guest in studio here with me, Richard. Welcome.
Thank you.
What's on your mind?
Of all our political leaders, both provincial and federal, who, in your opinion, has actually handled this situation the best so far?
I think Danielle Smith has been the best, and of course she's the ball game. Alberta's the ball game. It's really the biggest part of Canada's wealth value. And she said, you know, you can't do that. That doesn't sound right. She was very polite, but she said, retaliation is not going to happen. That's silly. And she's right on that, too. I like Doug's style. You know, he's in there fighting, and how dare you? And he is, as Conrad says, Captain Canada. But I think the two of them actually should run the country. That would be a good idea.
Jim, I see you shaking your head there.
I don't know who's done the best, but Danielle Smith has done the worst. She went down there, she put sectional interests, her support for the oil industry ahead of everything else, and just tried to get an exemption for Alberta. That's what she was doing. And by coming out as a provincial leader and saying we're not going to retaliate via energy exports, she overstepped her mandate. It's the federal government that manages international trade. And also, you know, threw away some of her cards, and just as the poker game's getting started. So she's been motivated by a desire to help Alberta escape and let the rest of the country sink, and that's no good.
Yep. Well, look, I think both Ford and Smith have been doing a good job for the respective populations, and they're in very different positions. If oil exports were shut down, you may as well shut down all of Alberta. Forget about the pain to the rest of the country, but the entire economy is running on oil. So she has to say these things publicly. She cannot come out and say, yes, I'm in favor of shutting down oil exports. Why are the premiers having to do this, though? Because there's a complete lack of federal leadership. Justin Trudeau, the prime minister of the day, should be handling this. He decided to put party first and his own personal interest first, and instead of leadership in Ottawa, we've got a Liberal leadership race. He's not exactly speaking to the people he needs to speak to right now, but Ford and Smith have been doing that for weeks.
It does feel like we're throwing spaghetti at the wall, Warren.
The two best representatives of the country have not been politicians. They've been Jean Chrétien, who wrote, my former boss, full disclosure, who wrote a piece that people responded to across the country.
Can I pull up a quote from that piece, actually?
Please.
Let's read it. Every time that Mr. Trump opens his mouth, he creates new allies for all of us. So let's get organized. To fight back against a big, powerful bully, you need strength in numbers.
And the other great person showing great leadership was Stephen Harper, who came out a few days later. He did an interview with an American podcaster, and he said things much like what my former boss did, and the two of them were very much in sync. We're getting back to Jim's point, when you're dealing with a bully, which is what Trump is, you don't, as a negotiating strategy, say in your very first utterance, he's right, which is what Smith did. You show some strength. You show a willingness to be flexible and to negotiate. And that's what Ford has done. That's what Dominic LeBlanc has done at the federal level. But you don't just fold like a cheap suit. And I think the politicians who are going to succeed and prevail in this extraordinary situation we find ourselves in are the ones who show some strength.
Conrad.
I actually agree with almost everything that has been said, and I would launch a vigorous defense for Danielle Smith. I think we should remember that her province has been a victim in Confederation recently, and we've effectively, because of a ludicrous preoccupation with a particular version of climatological matters, we've declared war on the oil and gas business, which is our greatest industry. And she and the Albertans have a very legitimate grievance. So I cannot fault her for what she did in visiting President Trump. But on the other hand, Doug Ford has a different position. It's a different province economically, and he's in a different stage of the election cycle. So I think they're doing well. But the answer to your original question is, I think Pierre Poilievre is the man. He's not saying much. He is not waving the flag around and masquerading as somebody who's going to lead a virtual David and Goliath war against the U.S. He is behaving like a sensible person who thinks that these things will be negotiated by the trade wonks and the specialists in the two countries' governments in due course. And that's the right posture for him. I don't think Justin handled our relations with the U.S. well at all. And as for Chrétien, I mean, all he ever did in the relations with the U.S. was posture and play the little guy from Shawinigan and we won't be bullied by the Americans, whoever the president is, which is fine, I guess, but it's not a very creative policy. Mr. King did much better in his relations with Roosevelt. Brian Mulroney did much better in his relations with Reagan and Bush Sr. I mean, you can get on with the Americans, you know, the Poles and people like that, envious having them as neighbors, annoying though they are at times. But with that said, and my wife accuses me of waving the Canadian flag around too much. I think we could be one of the greatest countries in the world. We're just not politically behaving like it. But don't overreact to Trump. He's got his methods. He has a clear mandate. And, he's been one of the most successful politicians in the history of the country.
All right, we'll have to leave it there. Coming up next, Lieutenant General Richard Rohmer, who back in 1973 wrote the best-selling novels Ultimatum and Exoneration, joins me to talk about his predictions then of a U.S. invasion of Canada next. Earlier, I had the chance to sit down with Major General retired Richard Rohmer. You might know him as one of Canada's most decorated military figures. But 50 years ago, he also wrote about a scenario where the U.S. invades Canada. It's a fascinating conversation given today's headlines. Here's what he had to say. General Richard Rohmer, it is such an honor to have you in studio with me. In the 70s, you penned two best-selling novels, Ultimatum, which I have here, and Exoneration, which 50 years later feels remarkably prescient. For those who have not had an opportunity to read these novels, give us the storyline.
The storyline is very simple. There was a confrontation between Canada and the United States. Our relationship with the United States then and the relationship with the United States now has always been friendly, but always undercurrent of somebody wanting to take advantage of somebody else.
In it, the United States invades Canada militarily. What happens?
What happens is that Canada repulses the invasion. In Ultimatum, I put the stresses together. What's causing all this? Well, the United States at that time needed natural gas. Mm-hmm. And they wanted Canada to provide the natural gas because we've got lots of it. And they came to the point where the government of the United States said, you're either going to give us the gas or we will take it from you. Mm-hmm. And that was the basic of the confrontation between the United States and Canada in Ultimatum. Mm-hmm. And that's the kind of mode we're in now with the President of the United States who's coming in, has decided he's going to use some leverage, if he can, which he can, against Canada for some purposes that he has in mind are economic.
How do you interpret that threat, General? The idea of annexation, certainly as you suggest in this book, with heavy fighting and so on, it seems extreme. There was a time in Canada's history when it was deadly serious, but today it seems almost impossible. But how do you interpret the threat?
The threat is, with the President of the United States making the threats that he's doing, you've got to take this man seriously. I'm a human being in Canada, and I'm a Canadian from the word go. I don't like the comment particularly at all, but on the other hand, I'm not prepared to react in any way other than say, let us talk and negotiate and let's decide how things can be done for the United States to achieve its goals, and at the same time for Canada to achieve its stability and its goals and its sovereignty. Mm-hmm. I think it's something, we're at a stage now where we're going to find out how real he is in terms of his intent. When he becomes president, we'll find out in about 5 minutes.
Your books really do tap into a fierce sense of Canadian pride, and I do think that a fear or the threat of annexation contributes to a sense of nationalism among Canadians. Do you think that that has evolved over the years? Do you think Canadians still feel that same sense of grit and pride for their country, or has it evolved?
Well, I think that the whole business of Canada's pride and sovereignty and all of that kind of stuff has certainly matured. We've got people now in Canada those books were written in the 1950s and 60s and 70s. The world is completely different now. We've got millions of people who come here to live in Canada for their own purposes, that know nothing about our traditions or backgrounds or our country. So they're a factor in terms of what we have to be thinking about. The reality is we are going to be put to a test, I think, sometime very soon as to what we are prepared to do in terms of protecting our sovereignty and keeping our country going. And we have to pay attention to the President of the United States once he takes office, for sure. But the reality is, Canada is a fantastic country, the best country in the world as far as I'm concerned to live in, and the finest country in the world to stand up for, and I intend to do that so long as I am able.
All right, Lieutenant General, thank you for being here. I so appreciate you taking the time.
My privilege to be here with you and taking time.
A fitting close to the show tonight, with the General wrapping up on a patriotic note. That's it for us this evening. If you'd like to get in touch, you can send us an email at comments@thezoomer.com. As always, a big thank you to my panel, and of course to you at home. We'll see you soon. For now, it's time to zoom out.